Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. We welcome everyone to today's hearing on the southern border, the Constitution, and the states. Without objection, our colleagues, Mr. Biggs and Mr. Armstrong, will be able to participate in the hearing today for the purpose of questioning the witnesses if a member on the subcommittee yields him time for that purpose. I will now recognize myself for an opening statement. I want to thank our witnesses for appearing before the committee today. Thank you for your time and your service. We are here today because the President of the United States is failing to fulfill his duty to defend our country, to defend the borders of the United States, as required by the Constitution. Specifically, the Constitution states, the United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government and shall protect each of them against invasion. Now, I've read and heard and I'm aware of the academic arguments about the definition of invasion, and I'm sure we'll cover that in the hearing today. But the reality of those of us living on the front lines, the reality of those of us who live in Texas, Arizona, and states along the border, that notwithstanding any protestations to the contrary, we are experiencing an invasion at the southern border. Since the beginning of this administration, there have been more than 7 million encounters at our southern border. Now, that in and of itself doesn't define an invasion. But when you compare it to the 2.4 million encounters of the previous administration, and when you look at what's actually occurring now, with over 5 million aliens having been released into the United States, which includes more than 1.8 million known gotaways. This is a mix of releases, gotaways, people that have come in under the so-called CBP-1 app released, people that have been released in the United States with dates to appear as late as 2035, 2031, 2, 4, 5. And these numbers on the gotaways, by the way, are likely conservative estimates. Secretary Mayorkas himself admitted some 85% of migrants encountered at the border are being released immediately, automatically released into the United States. That is not a border. That does not allow for any actual determination of an asylum claim or any legitimate claim under law. Importantly, these releases include hundreds, thousands of criminals that have wreaked havoc on our communities. In 2022, 20-year-old Kayla Hamilton was raped and murdered in her home in Maryland by an MS-13 gang member released by this administration. We have examples like that in every state in the union, and we have hundreds of examples like that in Texas of criminal activity, of people being released by this administration. Even those with ties to extremist groups and activities have entered the country through our border. This includes a migrant wanted in Senegal for terrorism-related crimes. Last March, a member of the terrorist group Al-Shabaab crossed the southern border, was released, traveled to Minnesota, where he was eventually arrested by ICE. Again, there are many of these examples. Indeed, since the beginning of fiscal year 2021, 331 known or suspected terrorists have been caught crossing the southern border. Now, I know my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, some witnesses will pull that apart about, well, what lists do you have that are associated with terrorists? Is it a real terrorist list? Well, is it FARC, but it's not a certain part of the world? The fact is, there is an increasing number of known individuals affiliated with dangerous groups across this world that are flooding into the United States because this administration refuses to carry out its constitutional duty to maintain operational control of the border on behalf of the United States. By the way, that 331 compares to just 11 from 2017 to 2020 under the administration of President Trump. And with the 1.8 million known gotaways, we have no idea how many terrorists and criminals have escaped undetected, because these are the individuals that are actually not seeking Border Patrol. They're not coming across the river and saying, please, hi, Border Patrol, I'm here. Can you take me in, send me over to an NGO, and release me into the United States, which is what we're doing to the vast majority of the numbers. But some 50,000 a month are coming in, and we don't know who they are. But we know that there's some dangerous individuals because we know that they flee Border Patrol. The flow of illegal immigration has also levied unbearable costs on American communities, particularly in Texas. American students have been kicked out of their schools so the buildings can be used to house illegal aliens. The healthcare system is burdened by unpaid medical bills for services provided to illegal aliens. Texas has been forced to spend at least $12.5 billion of its own funds to try to fill the void. This invasion of our southern border is a clear and present danger to the citizens of this country, and particularly to the people that I represent in Texas, as do my colleagues from Texas. A record number of Texans and Americans are dying from cartel and Chinese-driven fentanyl pouring across our southern border. Now, I've seen and read the articles by my colleagues on the left, academics on the left, who say, well, that's just fentanyl. It comes through the ports of entry. Nothing you can do can stop that. It has nothing to do with the fact that we have wide open borders, despite the fact that the experts on the borders, the Border Patrol folks who have to actually do the job, who are pulled off the line to process people in direct contravention of our laws, they will tell you that this is much worse because they're unable to police the borders. They're unable to do their job between the ports of entry or at the ports of entry at the level that they should be able to do so. As a result, 6 children in the school district in which my family resides, just southwest of Austin in Hays County, Texas, died from fentanyl poisoning last year alone. We've had witnesses testify here. We had the mother and the father of one of those kids testify here. We just ignore it. We ignore this grim reality of what's happening to our country. Since 2021, over 5,000 people have died of fentanyl poisonings in Texas alone, but Texas has actually been on the low end historically, but it's going up. Most of the traffic went through Texas to other parts of the country, but now it's sticking. More than 75,000 Americans have died of fentanyl-related poisonings in 2022 alone. We're still waiting for the 2023 data. Over 200 a day. It's basically an airplane full of human beings that are American citizens or people that live in this country who have died from fentanyl-related poisonings every day. I met last week in Bracketville, Texas, about 3 hours from my house, about 45 miles from Eagle Pass, with about 200 landowners and local officials in South Texas, breaking down in tears at the destruction of their community. One rancher who's had to fix his fence 400 times. He's had to repair his fence 400 times in the last 3 years. A ranch he's had in his family, losing livestock. Now, people dismiss that as if it's no big deal, but it is a really big deal to the families and the ranchers who have ranched South Texas for years. Talk to residents who live near the border, have high-speed car chases that are commonplace, that result in the death of American citizens recently and migrants. We act like this is compassionate, that 1,000 migrants died along the southwest border of the United States last year. Almost 1,000. And this flow of illegal immigration has enriched and emboldened the cartels. John Mudlin, the chief Border Patrol agent in the Tucson sector, has told Congress that, quote, nobody crosses without paying the cartels. So the cartels determine when people cross, how many people cross at the time, all of that. It's controlled by them. Now, we all know that. We've seen numerous embed reporters who start in South America, come up through the Darien Gap, go through the entire process that the United Nations is fueling, China is helping fund, cartels are getting enriched by, moving human beings for profit into the United States through a dangerous journey where individuals die along that journey, little girls get sold into the sex trafficking trade. All of that happens, and it's purposeful to flood the United States so that people like our colleague, Yvette Clarke from New York, can say, quote, I need more people in my district just for redistricting purposes, end quote. In the context of a conversation about saying there's no more room in the inn for people to come to the United States. That was the direct quote. This is very clearly an invasion. It is a purposeful one, and it's inflicting dangerous consequences on our country and the people of Texas. We're here to talk about the constitutional powers for states to be able to manage that process in the absence of any effort by the federal government. The Constitution contemplates that states could repel and defend themselves against invasion because they expected the federal government to do its job. In almost a throwaway clause at the end of Article 1, but a clause nonetheless, it says the governors, the people of the state, have the right to defend themselves. It says, quote, no state shall, without the consent of Congress, lay any duty of tonnage, keep troops or ships of war in time of peace, enter into any agreement or compact with another state or with a foreign power, or engage in war, unless actually invaded or in such imminent danger as will not admit delay. Now, why would this be? Could it be because, as Thomas Jefferson put it, self-preservation is paramount to all law? The fact of the matter is, of course, the people of Texas have a right to defend themselves, just as I have a right to defend my home and my family if it is under attack. I don't go check the statute book. I don't go open the Constitution to determine what I do in the face of a danger posed to the people in my home, my family, as a citizen who derives his rights and the rights for my family from God, not from the government. We have the right to defend ourselves. It is inherent. The Constitution reflects that, and it reflects the fact that governors and states should step in if the federal government refuses to do its job. I look forward to hearing the comments from our witnesses and get their perspectives on these topics.
Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Roy, is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman. What we're not talking about and what the President of the United States tomorrow night in the House chamber will not talk about is Laken Riley or Kayla Hamilton or Aiden Clark or Elizabeth Medina, a Texan I would note, or Jeremy Pau Caceres, forgive if that's not the correct pronunciation, who was a 2-year-old who was killed right here in Montgomery County, Maryland, just outside of the District of Columbia. My colleagues will not be talking about these individuals. The President of the United States will not be talking about these individuals. We have the former press secretary of the White House under President Biden, who's on MSNBC with a bunch of, I'll just call them left-leaning journalists, mocking and laughing at the Commonwealth of Virginia for their concern about the impacts of illegal aliens on their communities. The reality is there are significant concerns and the impacts of illegal aliens on the communities that we represent. That's the truth. My Democratic colleagues don't want to talk about that. They want to hide behind a Senate bill that had no chance, zero, of passage, was purposely constructed to give cover for those who know full well, because the American people are very clearly seeing it with their eyes, that this administration is purposely failing to secure the border of the United States. With Democrats like Mark Elias, who is out there doing what? Challenging laws in Arizona to make it not possible for those who are here illegally to vote. Now, why would he do that? Why do you suppose he would do that? I don't know. Got some thoughts on that. I think it's pretty self-evident. The fact is, what we have here is a bill in the Senate that would not have addressed the parole issue, would not have addressed catch and release, and in fact would have codified catch and release, not actually dealt with the issues that are problematic under the Flores settlement, which was what we used to talk about when we talked about catch and release. Now catch and release is just basically another way of saying mass releases. We would have exempted UACs under the Senate bill. The fact is they would have alternatives to detention under the catch and release program, which would have been codified, which basically means you're just codifying releases. We all know that. We all knew that when my colleague says, oh, well, you were against the bill before it got released. Because I don't know, we can actually capable of talking to our colleagues on the other side of the building, know what was going to be in the bill, and then oppose what we knew what was coming out. Just like I could oppose the appropriations bills before the final product is done, because I don't know, I've been in this godforsaken town long enough to know that I'm going to get a bill that, as the bill we're voting on this week, busts the caps, spends more money, increases interest, increases spending, doesn't actually make any of the policy changes we promised. That's the town. You can actually oppose it beforehand with almost 100% degree certainty when you know exactly what's coming out through the system. And the system in this bill, which was very clear from all the signals being sent by the usual suspects, including the Chamber of Commerce Republicans, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are alluding to, who were praising the bill, the same Republicans who have been complicit for several decades in allowing a border situation to get to the situation where we have thousands of Texans who are getting impacted by what's actually happening. The ranchers who find dead bodies, who find migrants sitting along the Rio Grande, they're all sitting there, they're calling me today, dealing with those bodies as we speak. The Texas reality of 299,000 over the last roughly decade, people incarcerated in Texas jails, classified as illegal aliens. Of those numbers, there were 719,000 criminal offenses. 719,000 criminal offenses in the state of Texas. 732 homicides, 34,569 assaults, 10,198 burglaries, 40,963 drug-related crimes, 462 kidnappings, 26,991 thefts, 26,991 obstruction of police, 2,759 robberies, 4,483 sexual assaults, 5,003 sexual offenses, and 4,167 weapon convictions. That's not trivial. Those are real crimes throughout the state of Texas that people are dealing with. All of those were documented under the statistics in Texas for DPS as the crimes committed by illegal aliens in the state of Texas. And those numbers have done nothing but go up under this administration. The legislation before us attempts to address one aspect of that, robbery and those kind of related crimes, not unlike the bill that we have on the floor, the Lake and Riley Act. I yield back.
Mr. Roy.
Thank the chairman. Thank the witnesses for being here and providing your testimony. Mr. Homan, a quick question. Would you characterize my engagement with the Trump administration with respect to border security as strong, as supportive of what the Trump administration was doing and working with you, maybe Mr. Morgan and others, to try to accomplish the objectives of securing the border of the United States?
Yes, sir.
Would you characterize, based on your knowledge, that in some way, shape, or form, I, though, bow down to the former president? Would you think that would be the common knowledge of people out in the world, that somehow that is my position?
Not you.
Is it true that I endorsed an opponent of the former president in the primary?
Yes, sir.
Is it true that the former president called on a primary challenger for me in December?
Sir.
That the former president called on a primary challenger for me in December?
Yes, sir.
So the reason I bring that up is, are you also aware that I opposed fairly vigorously and loudly the Senate bill prior to the former president's commentary on the bill?
You and every expert I know that wore the uniform and did the job.
And numerous Republicans that you know and work with that were concerned and seeking guidance on what we were hearing in terms of what the Senate bill was going to be and how it was produced, expressed opposition to the bill prior to the former president commenting on the bill.
Yes, because we believe H.R. 2 is a fix.
And so the Senate bill was a fix.
No, we
Right.
believe H.R. 2.
You believe H.R. 2 is the bill that would fix the problem. The Senate bill is a bill that was a fake bill by our Democratic colleagues
Right.
to have something to hide behind.
The Senate bill would not have solved the problem. H.R. 2 would have solved the problem because it's based on policies that we prove were effective.
So this notion that our Democratic colleagues are putting forth for people to believe as we head into the State of the Union tonight that the Senate bill would actually solve the problem is false. And the idea that somehow it is Republicans who are the problem because they put up a fake bill that wouldn't secure the bill, that would codify the mass releases, that is somehow the actual reality, correct?
I think the Senate bill was an attempt to switch gears and put it on the Republicans because they
Correct.
would never pass the House.
So to that point, I think it is critically important for Mr. Hamilton, you'd have the opportunity to maybe respond to some of the accusations made about the Trump administration, about the policies. Do you have some thoughts on those?
Well, I certainly do, and thank you for the time. Look, our policies that we adopted across the Trump administration and throughout the Trump administration were about securing the border, about protecting the integrity of our immigration system, and reducing human suffering. It's undoubted, no one can deny the fact that there are countless people who are harmed on the journey up to the United States, who are trafficked, who are enslaved here in the United States. And if we want to talk about family separations, I'd like to point out that this administration's policies have led to 500,000 children being separated by their parents coming to the United States by themselves and subjected to who knows what and lost by this Department of Health and Human Services. No one cares. No one cares where those kids are in this administration. No one's going out and looking for them. So for all these crocodile tears that are shed about what happened in a prosecution policy during the Trump administration, nobody cares about the 85,000 plus kids that this administration has lost and the 500,000 kids who have been trafficked here during this administration.
And the children that have been lost by this administration, they don't even know where they are, right, through ORR.
They're gone.
And another issue here that I think merits consideration is the extent to which The allegation that you've got members of the Republican conference who have expressed a belief that this administration could actually reverse a lot of the damage that it has done, compared to our simultaneous belief that we need legislation to fix problems. Those two things can be true, correct? The idea that we're talking about 212F, which by the way has not been fully explored, but also the notion that parole has been being abused for mass releases, which is precisely how the individual got into the United States that killed Lake and Riley, by mass releases. Is that true, Mr. Hamilton?
That's true.
Is that true, Mr. Homan?
Yes.
And so the idea that you don't also need legislation to deal with Flores, catch and release, the issues that you had previous rulings by courts that caused the family separation type issues is false. Of course we need legislation, but we need legislation that works. H.R. 2 would work. The legislation would actually solve problems. It would create an environment where it could enforce the law. It would hold the administration accountable, and it would give power for states to be able to hold it accountable. And the idea that you can't have that at the same time is saying that this president is responsible through mass parole to endangering the American people is a fiction by our Democratic colleagues trying to obfuscate and cover up for the open border policies killing Americans. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Correa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, let me say that
Chairwoman, my friend, Mr. Westerman, just a couple quick questions. The ranking members talked about somehow this is good for, individuals who are, quote, polluters. I know at least one of the bills we're talking about is important with respect to the Duluth complex, right? And that would, it could constitute a sizable portion. I've got 88% down in my notes, but I know it's a very large percent of the cobalt reserves in the United States. Currently, we're highly dependent on China for cobalt, correct?
Very dependent on China for cobalt and many other minerals and rare earth elements.
And is it not true that the Biden administration, with its senseless, job-killing, hard-working, American, life-destroying tailpipe rule that will stack up more mandates on electric vehicle production to the tune of something like 2/3 of the production by 2030, meanwhile EVs are piling up on the lots of automobile dealerships across the country, that in light of that even if one were to say that we should be moving towards electric vehicles, which I think is a reasonable question to debate in and of itself, would it not be foolish to do that on the back of Chinese production and Chinese cobalt mining?
I believe so, and I think you've done a great job of outlining what I would call Democrat utopia. We're going to have our cake and eat it too. We're going to get rid of fossil fuel. We're going to get rid of internal combustion engine vehicles. Everybody's going to drive an EV, and we're not going to mine anything to create the components that go into that EV, or to strengthening the grid, or to building wind and solar and more distributed electrical systems. And it just doesn't work that way. It's a not in my backyard mentality that is forcing our supply chains more and more to China, who has gone out and hoarded resources from around the world. Cobalt is one you mentioned that comes from the Congo, where
Right.
they use child slave labor.
Child slave labor, right?
They haul it back to China, where they refine it. And by the way, China built 50 gigawatts of coal-powered plants last year. That's one every 5 days, so they can process the minerals and manufacture the stuff to sell to us so that we can save the planet. It makes absolutely no sense.
Representative Ocasio-Cortez, what do you say to that point, right? When we've got a significant amount of evidence that China owns the vast majority, if not all, 80% plus of the cobalt mine production coming out of Congo, et cetera. And we know, I think it's irrefuted, that there's child labor exploited to get those minerals. Those minerals are central, if not fully necessary, for the production of EVs, which even objectively we have to acknowledge are not fully able to power the ability of the American public to get to their jobs and their work and so forth. And yet we're mandating that we have 2/3 of the production be EVs by 2030. So if we follow those mandates by the Biden administration, that debate aside, right? Debate for a different day. If you follow those mandates, you got to have a massive, massive amount of battery production. And by all indication, the vast majority of that Congo production is controlled by China. A huge amount of that has child labor and other issues that we've talked about. And you got trafficked child slaves that are reported in the production of it. Why on earth would we want to limit the ability of Americans to go mine cobalt? Now, I might say, well, that's kind of great because I actually still want the internal combustion engine. I actually think it's affordable and better for the American worker who wants the plumber in San Marcos, Texas, to be able to go to work and afford the car. But if you buy into the motion of having, EVs that you can drive all over creation, even if you're from Texas and you had to do like I did, I appreciate the chairman pointing out the passing of my grandma. I had to drive 6 hours, like 300 miles to go see my grandma Thursday before she passed away, and 6 hours back. I couldn't do that at an EV. I wouldn't have been able to make the round trip in time. But okay, assume we were able to ever produce the batteries that last long enough, the charging stations, all the stuff. Why would we get rid of the American production of it?
Thank you. There are several different components to your question. I want to make sure that I address them. First and foremost, on the issue of child exploitation, child labor, I think it is the role of the United States for us to push back forcefully on this production, and not just in the production of energy, but across the board. We see this in textile production, energy production, cobalt mining. It is horrific, and we need to make sure that our sources do not include child labor. But to get to the core of the question, too, on the China front, is that I find it interesting that there is this concern about Chinese ownership of minerals, and it is legitimate. However, the response to that seems to be deregulation specifically for companies that are largely Chinese-owned here in the United States. These companies are subsidiaries where the benefit of what we are deregulating here, and I'll give you a specific example. I would be remiss not to mention that the minerals produced specifically at the proposed Twin Metals mine that is implicated in this legislation would most likely be shipped to China for refining and smelting to be sold on the global market. These are not American-owned companies that American mined minerals would be going to. And so if your concern is the Chinese predominance of ownership in the mining market, I would be very concerned about passing this legislation. So that, I think, on the China piece there. And lastly, on the meeting our targets and mining cobalt. I think it's a false choice to say that in order for us to mine cobalt, we either have to destroy some of the most sacred lands in the United States or rely on child labor. There's responsible mining in the United States that is available to us. But secondly, I also find it interesting that the majority presently pushes back against battery recycling, which would allow us to open the path to reducing our reliance on mining in general. There is enormous potential in recycling many of these EV batteries, but we have not made the investments or the shifts necessary in order to unlock that so that we can reduce our reliance on solely mining as the only source of battery. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate that. Before I give my colleague a chance to respond, as I think he probably wishes to, I would only note that happy to have a conversation about restricting Chinese ownership of any number of corporate activities in the United States, or ownership of farmland, or ownership of land near military bases, or frankly, ownership of meat packing, production, including mineral production and so forth. A significant reason why it would be mined here and shipped back is because they've got all the production facilities, because they've been building and mining these, because they've got the resources to do that. And here we've got the God-given benefit in America being able to produce very clean burning natural gas, very efficient ability to have automobiles that have an internal combustion engine, which are basically fractionally about 1.5% of the CO2 production when you compare it to what we're producing in China, as the gentleman noted, where they've got 1,100 coal-fired plants burning in China, and we have 250, and they're building 2 a week, and we're building none. And yet we're building no nuclear plants except for the Georgia plant that was finally put online 45 years after it was permitted by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So I think if we're going to be serious about it, we can't say. I just don't accept the premise that the sort of general notion of, well, we got to push back on the child labor. Well, I mean, we're going to use that child labor unless we find a supply right now, because the Biden administration has put their foot on the gas to say we must have EVs in 2030 at the extent of 2/3 of our entire production line. So Toyota is not a Chinese-owned company, but Toyota has a massive production facility in San Antonio. Tells me that they will largely have to put their entire assembly line starting next year into EVs pretty much only, because they can't financially afford to do otherwise with these mandates on the tailpipe rule, which will be shutting down the internal combustion engine production of the Toyota vehicles. No Chinese ownership there, because that's where they are, which will then mandate the EVs, driving up the price of those vehicles. And then they got to go figure out how to get the batteries and get the production. I know the gentleman seemed like he wanted to jump in on that, and so I'd like to give him a chance to respond.
I appreciate the opportunity to respond. So many things to talk about here, and I agree with the assertion that we don't have the refining and the smelting capacity in the U.S., but that's self-imposed. You go back to 1995, we produced 3 times the copper of China, and today they produce 11 times more copper than us. They have 50 smelters, and we have 2. That's another area of regulation that's forced business like that out of our country to China, and they're making the things that we need. We're exporting wealth to China to build these projects, and we have the resources that have made this country strong and that are still here to make us strong in the future if we will just use them.
Well, I appreciate the gentleman. I will, in the interest of time, yield back. I know there's other issues here. I would just push back on the general notion that these aren't important pieces of legislation. I mean, dealing with figuring out how we're going to protect our federal lands and the wildlife and the ability for hunters and anglers to use them, all that stuff are all part of this legislation, and we all share an interest in conservation in that respect. Look at Texas. We have very little federal ownership of the land, happily so. But where we have federal lands, we ought to try to manage it appropriately for good stewardship for multiple generations, including production and AMWR, which is a tiny, tiny fraction of the footprint of the entire state of Alaska. Lots of studies about wildlife benefits and so forth. But we'll put that aside for a different day, and I'll yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Roy. Ms. Scanlon?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I am very concerned that these bills are a huge step back for our environment and our endangered species. They seem to be predicated on a false kind of a binary choice. And I don't think it's true that President Biden or Democrats or the American people have any interest in having a blanket prohibition on development, but we do want a system that fairly takes into account public safety, conservation, and the damage to our environment and our children's future if we aren't taking those into consideration. So can you comment on that?
Absolutely, Representative Scanlon. As you noted, particularly in the public land rule, specifically, this shift in the rule is not even to put conservation and restoration above, energy production, recreation, or any other considerations. It's simply to allow the consideration to be on equal footing. And I would emphatically push back on the notion that conservation is just simply cordoning off, that this rule is just about conservation and cordoning off several acres of land and saying there's nothing to be done here. But this is also about land restoration. And there are so many acres of land, federal lands, public lands. This is land that belongs to the people of the United States of America, that has been dumped on, that has been allowed to be overridden with toxic waste, that people are getting sick from, that species are becoming endangered from. And to allow that to simply be in equal consideration as the federal government and the Bureau of Land Management doles out and makes decisions, oftentimes affirmatively about energy production, I think is eminently reasonable.
I think that makes a lot of sense, that we're trying to balance some competing concerns, but that we really do need to take into account these conservation concerns. So I would yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Scanlon. Mr. Scott?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll just be quick. I mean, I'm thankful for the legislation on that supports hunters and fishermen. I mean, I think, the more time a child spends.
Gentleman yields back, Chair. Thanks, the gentleman. Gentleman from Texas is recognized for questions.
Yeah, I just have a few questions. I'd just like to ask each of the panelists, how many people do you think are in the United States right now illegally?
So, Mr. Roy, it's impossible to say, but I can tell you that for a good 20-year period from the early 2000s until about 2 years ago, the number that was often quoted by media types was 11 million. They now, the numbers that I hear now are consistently between 20 and 40 million illegally in the country.
How many people, and now I'll allow Mr. Raskin to answer. So the illegal, that was sort of what we sort of generally refer to as illegally present. How many, in general, how many people here who are non-citizens, legally plus illegally? Do you know?
Non-citizens is around 50 million. You got 22 million? Oh, okay. The number I just was given by staff is 22 million.
On the what, illegal number?
No, I think that's the legal foreign residents.
Do you know, Mr. Raskin?
Yeah, but I thought it was generally around 20 million who are lawful non-citizens in different categories, mostly permanent resident green card holders. And the number I've seen kicked around for undocumented is something like 10 or 12 million.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I ask is because I've seen wildly varying numbers, various studies. I mean, MIT has a study they did with Yale or somebody, I can't remember, it was a joint study. Then there was some other studies that have showed the numbers, and they vary wildly. My point of asking is bifurcating the questions that are presented by the legislation, right, into should we find out who is here and whether they are citizens or not, and how to do that. Is it surveys? Is it via the census question? And then the second question, of course, is then what to do about that vis-a-vis apportionment and the constitutional questions and legal questions that flow from that. So on the first question, what I wanted to say, because it was posited earlier, and I wanted Mr. Raskin and Mr. Biggs can answer the question for good of everybody, about whether or not the court, in responding to President Trump and I guess Commerce Secretary Ross's efforts on the question, was whether that said that Congress couldn't act. I thought it was speaking directly to the executive branch's actions as opposed to just Congress. But I'd like both of you to respond to that. Ms. Raskin, you start, Mr. Biggs.
Yeah, but I read it the same way, Mr. Roy. But here's what Section 2 of the 14th says. Representatives shall be apportioned among the several states according to their respective numbers, counting the whole number of persons in each state, excluding Indians not taxed. So in defining the whole number of persons, the court has been emphatic that that means the whole number of persons in the plain meaning sense and not the whole number of voters or citizens or.
So again, that to me gets to the second part of the question. In this legislation, right, we're posing two pieces to it. One is whether we ask. Do we just simply want to know? And we put that on the question and say, okay, are you a citizen or not? And then get that information from 330 million or whatever kids, people responding. And we get all that information, we figure out, okay, are you a citizen or are you not a citizen? Are you legally here or are you not legally here? It strikes me that that is just a basic function of government, that we should do that. Now, there's questions that are raised in opposition to that about whether that would scare people, and they're not going to, all the things, all the political questions. But I just want to kind of bifurcate the questions because the argument, which is debatable, about the 14th Amendment interpretation and how it would apply, what the court would do or not, that's one question. The first question that I just kind of want to make sure I understand is, with respect to the court's opinion vis-a-vis Trump, Ross et al. In 2020 and the census, I read that to mean that was talking about their executive action on that. Congress, they left open whether Congress could do it or not, or maybe even explicitly said Congress could do it. I haven't read the opinion in a while.
Mr. Roy, they specifically said Congress can ask
Right, okay.
citizenship questions.
Couldn't remember if it was open or explicit. So my point being, if we believe, arguments notwithstanding, debate on the floor, that it is in the interest of the country to ask the question and just say, are you a citizen or not? Let's collect that information, now let's do something with it. Now, maybe that doing something with it might be seem nefarious to others and some on different issues or whatever, but it seems to me a just basic, obligation on our part to say that, yeah, the federal government ought to know the people who are in this country, are you here? Are you a citizen? Are you here legally? And so forth. And then the policy prescription should flow from that. Again, I understand the argument will be that people are here illegally, they don't want to fill out the forms, they're not going to say they're here, so then you're going to say they're undercounting, so you got people who are here who aren't done, don't have papers, they don't want to answer the question. I get all those arguments, but I'm just saying as a prudential matter as a nation, shouldn't we know who's here? And shouldn't we do that without just guessing? I think that's my question. Either one, yeah, Mr.
Well, no,
Raskin.
but I think you've analyzed it correctly. I think you've got the arguments right. But you're just addressing the first point.
Right.
That this would be optional to do and arguably constitutional to do. And there might be equities on both sides, but appended to it is a clearly unconstitutional provision.
Well,
And
go ahead, Mr.
if I can just respond to that, I think it's far less clearly unconstitutional than my colleague asserts.
So what you're talking about, you're talking about the second
Yeah, we're
piece of
talking about the
question?
apportionment, because
Yeah, okay.
there is no mandate in any of the canon of law that's interpreted this that is requiring.
Would the gentleman pause for 1 second? Because I want to address that question
Yeah.
separately. But do we agree it is constitutional, lawful, Congress can do it, it's a prudential question, should we or should we not put a question on the census to determine whether or not you're a citizen or not? It's just a question of policy for us. So I want to separate those questions about whether it's constitutional or not. And then another question is, if we pass this legislation that has the two components to it, you shall ask the question, and then when you get that, you shall apportion based on citizenship, right? That's effectively what the bill says, right? That if the court were to strike down the second part, would that necessarily strike down the first part?
No, there's a severability clause.
Right, I think it's
argue there's a
important for
severability
the
clause.
body to know that. So we pass the legislation, you put that forward, you have the first component, should we know? Great, that's a good question. We can debate that policy. Second question is then should it apply for apportionment? Should that mandate on apportionment then survive constitutional scrutiny?
Yeah,
And so then I think that now begs that question on whether it would survive constitutional scrutiny. Now, gentlemen, please proceed with your thoughts, and then Mr. Raskin, yours, which you've already said about Section 14.
Mr. Raskin and I have a strong disagreement on the constitutionality. He quotes a portion of Section 2 of the 14th Amendment, but doesn't quote all of it. Because when you go to the back end of that same section, you'll see that there's a delineation and specific language that talks, with at least regard to the Electoral College, that apportionment can be lost because of disqualification of electors or voters. So that becomes an interesting dynamic to me. But I would also assert that our bill is consistent with my reading, at least certainly from dicta in Evanwall, that kind of gets to a different interpretation of whole. Even in that front section, you're not talking total. That becomes the real language. It's the total number. That's what they're asserting. And I'm asserting that this bill does not affect certainly the states.
My question that I'd ask Mr. Raskin, what's the limiting principle? Like, is there one?
To what?
To the question of whether it's a genuine question for a friend what would be the limiting principle on who is counted? So
Well, the census has said they don't count people who are, tourists from France who are in town. You've got to be living in the country.
Right, but is there a length of time that, and so my point is though, so this, Yeah,
Well,
go ahead, go ahead.
domicile, as you know, is defined as physical presence with intention to remain. And maybe there's some grayness around the margins on that, but basically we know people who are physically present and intend to remain.
This is shady for me in terms of my recollection, but I remember certain aspects of the history of this has also to do with not just physical presence, but allegiance and questions involving that. And so whether or not you're here and have allegiance to the United States, or, that those questions are relevant. And certainly we acknowledge that Congress, like in terms of interpreting the question, I mean, Congress has had to deal with figuring out the number of representatives that we have and, make decisions all the time. I mean, it's one person, one vote, but it's 750,000, as effective as 112,000 as it was at one point in time. I just made that number up, but whatever it was at some point mathematically. But my point is just, clearly there is room for congressional and executive interpretation and application, right, of what in fact it means to be here and be a person counted, and define that, right? And and clearly in the past we've asked questions of citizenship, like what, 1830 to 1950 or something like that. So I guess my point is, I don't know that it's absolute that the assertion on the constitutional question, but my point would be, if Congress believes we should do it, we have divisions on that question. If Congress believes that we should do it, I don't see the problem in passing forward something that we believe is, especially if you can argue, if you believe it's clearly unconstitutional, then you have an obligation to vote no. Absolutely. But if you think that there's a legitimate constitutional argument, that you think that you could say that, yeah, I think you can count them under my reading of the Constitution and application of it, and we should at least get the information. Send it to the court, or send it to the court. It gets litigated, the court gets it. Wherever they come down on the question, then we would just debate whether we amend the Constitution in the absence of that. But is that, roughly how you gentlemen see it?
That's pretty much how I see it.
Yeah.
When Mr. Biggs said, that there's another provision in the 14th Amendment which allows for reduction of the congressional delegation, that's true. That's if there's disenfranchisement of, at that point, it was the male African-American population, then you could reduce the congressional districts by a proportionate amount. But again, that's written in the Constitution. So, I take your basic point, which is you want to say, if you divide these two parts of the legislation, the first one could be voted on as a matter of policy, and of course we have just a fundamental disagreement about whether that makes any sense to do it and why we would be doing it. I think it's Section 2 that gives the explanation for why it's being done, because they do want to use what's basically an unconstitutional formula for apportioning congressional districts. One that I think, and I appreciate, I know you are a man of principle, Mr. Roy, but I think your state would probably be hurt more than almost any other state in the union by this.
I think we would potentially lose a number of seats. Yes,
Yeah.
what those are, the gentlelady posited 7 seats, I think, or six seats as a possible suggestion, which is 4.5 million people, which tells me that we have a firm recognition of how many people are here who are not, who are undocumented and or documented and not citizens. That it is a very large number. Sure, yeah, of course.
We keep hearing you talk about undocumented.
I said both.
Yeah, but that number includes documented.
Right, I said both.
Yeah, and I think it's, I know, but I think it's really clear that we recognize that this impacts everybody who is here and residing, regardless of status of documentation. And that's really important to acknowledge, that this is a sledgehammer approach to an issue. If you have this issue,
Well,
I think you can take it up in a way that Mr. Raskin has noted.
Reclaim my time is, I've been saying both documented and undocumented. It's questions the numbers, right? We have, again, wildly varying estimates on the undocumented population, certainly a lot more than we do the documented non-citizen population, which has a massive impact in a number of different directions on that. My only point is to say is that if we're assuming 4.5 million in Texas, roughly, which is what the number would reflect if we're talking about 6 members of Congress, roughly, then we're assuming a very, very large number. And I'm just glad to acknowledge the numbers that we're talking about. The last question on this is, I just wanted to raise the issue on the legal immigration issue, because that's posited a lot. But I just wanted to kind of clarify it. I've seen a significant number of studies that suggest that there's about roughly 51 million foreign-born individuals in the United States, which reflects 16-ish% of the population, which puts it at the highest percentage we've ever had in our history in terms of calculating it. It's higher than the early 20th century when we had the explosion of immigration in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And currently, legally, to the best of the numbers that I have provided, and I know both of you are well-informed individuals. Obviously, Mr. Biggs has a lot of knowledge on the board of Arizona and committees of jurisdiction. But we've been running it roughly about 1 million people a year with some dips. I mean, in 20, because of COVID, in 21, there was a fall off in the 700,000 range, 740, back up to 22 and at 1 million. All of the teens was over 1 million a year. And I just wanted to, just for the purpose of the record, at least acknowledge whatever the percentages are in terms of applicants, our country remains a massively large door of individuals coming into the United States. If you're still talking about 1 million a year illegally on top of or separate from the population who's coming in through other channels, legally, illegally, et cetera. Would you agree with that, Mr. Biggs?
Yeah, more so than virtually all other countries combined, every year we allow legal migration. And I just want to make one, I do think it's rich with irony, when people claim that the language saying that this is unconstitutional is clear as it can be, but then refuses to use statutory language, even terms of art, on illegal aliens. I find that's rich with irony. I really do. Because, I mean, even Sting understands you have legal aliens and illegal aliens, and that's why in his song, Englishman in New York, he actually uses the term, actually correctly, the term of art, the statutory term. I just had to raise this, just a little cron.
Mr. Raskin, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, well, I agree with my friend from Texas so much, but I guess I just celebrate that fact. I mean, this is the greatest country in the world. Of course everybody wants to come here. I mean, Tom Paine, when he came over from the UK, he fell in love with the promise of America. He said, this land, if it lives up to its values, will be an asylum to humanity.
And I
not an insane asylum.
I appreciate that from my friend from Maryland. I would say that we can agree on that point. But all I'm trying to do is establish for the record, for the average listener, the average American, that we're going about 1 million a year on top of our current population, which is roughly 50 million foreign-born, the highest percentage in history. We can say good, bad, how we teaching, how we, how do people adopt and build our country? Like, how do we have unity as a country? These are all questions that we should be wrestling with as Americans. I'm just saying it's a very big number.
If you
especially when you add in parole and asylum.
I'd love to get your thoughts on this. I mean, I have in my office frequently people from the hotel industry, people from the construction industry, retail, saying we need people, we need more workers in the country. The hotels,
we're
all looking for workers. Yeah.
I would argue we should also stop paying people not to work, but that's a different debate for a different day. All I really wanted to do is say here is, well, I mean, the gentleman can look down, but we have a massive welfare state. And as Milton Friedman famously said, he'd love to have wide open borders if you don't have a welfare state. So we do have $34.5 trillion of debt and all the things that flow from that, and we do have problems we've got to deal with. All I want to do here, because all we're talking about is citizenship and census, is establish that we're talking about a question to know whether you're a citizen, and establish that we are bringing into this country roughly 1 million people a year, and we have 50.x million foreign born. So hardly a closed door, hardly a hey, you're not welcome. It's more of a question of trying to figure out how are we managing that? How are we dealing with that? And I'll make only one other point, is that with respect to Texas, is we have, we're a donor state still with respect to transportation dollars, which was the example used before, in terms of tax dollars versus roads received. And the 10th biggest economy in the world. I think the idea that apportionment is all about printing money and then doling it out, I think is a mistake. I think, because that's what we're doing. It's not like we're responsibly doing something to figure out how to allocate. We're literally just printing money and mortgaging the future to then dole it out to states based on apportionment. But with that, I'll yield back for the interest of time.
Gentleman yields back. Chair thanks the gentleman. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, all I want to do here is end this hearing.
Taxes. Thank my friend from Pennsylvania. I would ask my friend from Texas, Chairman, we've glossed over the impetus behind this, and I recognize that I think everyone in this room would acknowledge the horrific events of October 7th. But, there was, for example, a Time magazine article, the worst 45-minute film you will ever see, which is referencing the film that I think many in this room have seen or at least seen parts of. In the way they describe it, the appalling record of Hamas brutality has set a new standard in graphic evidence of unrivaled human atrocities. In the aftermath of October 7th, brutal massacre of 1,400 innocent Israeli civilians, including mass rapes, tortures, bonding and immolation of toddlers, beheadings, and live mutilation. The Israeli leadership wrestled with how to show the world these horrors without desecrating the memory and dignity of these victims, while also attentive to the privacy and suffering of the victims' families. Massive, horrifying video and photographic imagery of the grotesque scenes was available through the sickening scenes which greeted Israeli rescuers who found new victims alive. But even more footage was provided by the gleeful terrorists themselves from their own body cameras, dash cams, and the devices of victims as they were slaughtered. That's what happened. That's what happened. And when that sort of thing, when America's been attacked and when that sort of thing has happened, and when FDR sat in this very building, in the chamber in which we serve, and he described the day of infamy, and he went through and describing what had occurred when we were attacked by Japan, and then set out to say that we weren't to declare war, that we were in a state of war. And when he described all that, what he did not do was outline what the proper casualty ratio is. He said that we would win. And if I'm the Prime Minister of Israel, my goal is to win. Nothing more, nothing less. It is to win. It is to defeat the enemy that wants to eradicate my people and my country. Would we call on any leader of any sovereign nation to take a different approach when attacked brutally, and not just in a single event, not just some single moment? I would ask the chairman how aware he is, which I'm sure is quite aware, of the extent to which the population, by any objective poll, by international organizations and media, of the people in Gaza, of what their perspective is on the appropriateness of the attacks by Hamas on Israel. Can the gentleman speak to that?
Well, there's massive celebration in the streets. Mr. Meeks and I visited the Prime Minister right after October 7th. And first thing he did is he showed the video of the Hamas attacks. And he's a very strong man. I've never seen tears in his eyes. Those are his own people. And he said, I want you to show this to Congress so they know what they did to my people, and I want them to remember it. And so we did. And we showed the video. Now I was in Kfar Aza, the kibbutz on the border with Gaza. And to know that entire community was wiped out, and the daycare center, the children were burnt alive, and the grotesque manner with which they carried themselves out. Israel does not target innocent civilians, Hamas does. Israel did not start this conflict, Hamas did. And Israel has the right to finish it. And the thing I find most egregious with this administration is that they're tying the hands of our greatest ally in the Middle East, and they're not allowing them to finish the job by Joe Biden saying, if you go into Rafah, I will cut off all weapons. What does that mean? And what kind of message is that sending to the rest of the world? I will cut off your weapons if you go into Rafah, which is the only way, sir, that Israel can finish this conflict. You compare it to 9/11, they experienced what is 20 times 9/11 on October 7th. And they're going to do this with or without us. But I say we stand with our ally and not abandon her at this critical point in time. And that's what I'm worried that this administration is doing.
I agree with the chairman, and I would note that there is a significant amount of polling. Here's one poll being conducted by the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research, which is funded by European Union and the United States-based Ford Foundation, which says that 71% of Palestinians in both the Gaza Strip and the West Bank believe Hamas made the right decision in attacking Israel. This is from March. There's additional polling that would suggest, for example, that 91% of Palestinians, according to the survey, do not think Hamas has committed war crimes. And 93% say the terrorist organization did not commit the well-documented acts of rape and civilian slaughter that took place on October 7th. My point being is it not also true that there is a significant, lack of clarity with respect to Hamas and the members of who might make up, for example, the battalions that the gentleman described, and the civilian population, and where those lines bleed? Is that not an accurate reflection of the difficulty with which Israel is faced with dealing with taking out the enemy combatants?
Absolutely. But the fact that they use their own people as human shields in hospitals, they take the hostages. This is why it's so difficult for Israel to go in. They want to protect innocent civilians, but it's Hamas that puts their own civilians at risk. It's Hamas that's blocking the checkpoints to block humanitarian assistance from coming in. They just killed 3 Israeli soldiers trying to bring humanitarian assistance into Gaza, and Egypt now is blocking the Rafah. Look, this is going down a very dangerous path in my view. If the optics are that we're now in defense of Hamas over Israel, and that's what, unfortunately, the optics are looking that way with this decision by the administration. Now, I understand, I know my friend is well-intended here, but in that part of the world, they understand power and strength. This looks like a weak moment to me, and it sends a really dangerous message to our adversaries.
Has it not been a dominant theory of the way we carry out our engagement in war to go in and just level the enemy, right? Was that not essentially the way we carried out our operations, for example, in Iraq in 2003 or in Desert Storm?
Israel is the only country I know that gives leaflets to evacuate.
Right.
Did Hamas give that opportunity to the Israelis? I don't think so. But they are giving 4 weeks to have innocent civilians evacuate. No other nation at war has done something like that. And I would say that, again, the ratio here is far better than our attempts in Mosul. That was 5-2. Here it's 2-1. West Point Academy says in urban warfare, the ratio is typically 9-1.
9-1, right.
That's
and
West Point
the United
Academy.
Nations has that data as well.
And the United Nations, and I would say that Israel is using exercising great caution to protect innocent lives.
Would it surprise the chairman to know that there's sources that show that Israel has made over 70,000 direct phone calls, sent over 13 million text messages, left over 15 million pre-recorded voicemails to notify civilians that they should leave combat areas, that they've given, in many cases, weeks of warning for civilians to evacuate the major urban areas of northern Gaza before it launched its ground campaign in the fall, that they dropped over 7 million flyers and deployed technologies wherever they could to try to ensure that people had ample room to get out from the attacks when they're trying to target the areas where Hamas had purposely embedded within the civilian populations while they would carry out their attacks on Israel from those positions?
That is all correct. And they're doing the same thing in Rafah right now to allow the opportunity for evacuation. No other nation on earth has ever gone to this extent to protect innocent civilians.
We've covered this. We've covered the ratios. I think that all of the evidence that I've looked at certainly points to the fact that Israel, frankly, may be studied for a long time in our military academies and in how one carries out warfare, particularly urban warfare in the modern context, on how to conduct such an operation in a way to get the result that you want to destroy the enemy while trying to minimize civilian deaths. Would the chairman agree?
We've never had a humanitarian zone set up in the middle of a war zone. So Israel, you're correct in this analysis. And for us to tie one hand behind their backs right now is the worst thing we can do.
Yeah, like I'll close with this by saying, look, I was fairly public in my opposition to our overall omnibus spending package for a variety of reasons that don't really address this specific issue. I opposed the foreign aid package for a variety of reasons involving both our lack of border security, my concerns in advancing with Ukraine without as clear of a mission as I think we should have, but in significant part with respect to the piece involving Israel, because of my concern that the $9 billion would be used in ways that would actually be counter to Israel, and my concerns in talking to people in Israel that it could be used that way. I understand my colleagues that reach a different conclusion on the balance of the interests, but my point of bringing that up is just to say, look, here we are. We have funded our regular, $4 billion-ish of MOU in the regular appropriations package. And we've got now was this 14 billion or 17 billion that was in the supplemental?
16, I think.
16 point something billion in the supplemental for Israel. And the administration, Congress having literally just acted to do this, and the administration is going to say, this administration knows best, when in fact it was this administration who this isn't the first time, right? They recently abstained from the United Nations Gaza ceasefire resolution, correct?
Correct.
The Biden administration tried to restart the failed Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, which would further legitimize and empower Iran, while we're currently removing the sanctions that are empowering Iran, which is undermining Israel, correct?
Correct, and the best thing we did in the supplemental is we reapplied those sanctions on energy and drones and rockets. Yeah.
And the Biden administration has let Iran access upwards of approximately $50 billion in revenue through this lack of sanction enforcement, correct?
Correct.
And the president then came into office, he restarted UNRWA, right? He took the affirmative step to restart UNRWA, which President Trump had stopped. We, Congress, had to step in and tell the administration in the appropriations package, stop funding UNRWA, something we'd been calling for. I introduced legislation 3 years ago to defund UNRWA, and we fought for it. We got that put in place. Why? Because finally they woke up on October 7th and said, oh, I guess some of these UNRWA folks are, in fact, saddling up and in bed with the terrorists. Correct?
That's all correct.
I appreciate what we're trying to do here. Obviously, there's some limits in what we can get out of the Senate, getting the president to sign a bill that would undermine his own authority, but the power of the purse is important. I'll close by just saying I wish we had used the power of the purse before we fully gave it up in order to stop the administration from doing this, but we are where we are, so we can try to use this. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair thanks the gentleman and recognizes the gentleman from New York for questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Well, I thank the chairman. I'd ask my friend from Arizona, when he was just describing, we're talking about the issue of the border, and obviously we've got legislation here talking about the impact on local law enforcement. We had a hearing in the Budget Committee last week, which we had testimony from the county attorney of Kinney County, Texas, just south of San Antonio, where he was describing the number of crimes. And I don't know if the gentleman saw the news reports from that hearing in which the county attorney from Kinney County, Texas, one of the main thoroughfares in South Texas, was describing approximately 150 crimes in 2021, which was the, last year of the policies before the Biden administration. And that last year, there were 6,700 crimes, 6,700 crimes. The year before, about 6,300 crimes. The year before that, about 3,000 crimes. There have been 15,000 crimes since 2021. And that is a direct consequence, a direct result of the open borders. It is the people of Kinney County who are left holding the bag. The people of Kinney County, whose law enforcement are the ones who have to go respond to this. It was a Kinney County resident who died because the EMT, the ambulance, couldn't get to that individual because that ambulance, the one ambulance they've got in the county of about 3,000 people, was over dealing with people who are there illegally because they're overwhelmed. Why? Because our borders are wide open and we all know it. Because anybody with eyes can see it. That's the truth. And when we talk about the border and we talk about the fentanyl that the gentleman from Arizona was talking about, and I want to turn it over to him to see if he agrees with me on both that point, and I'm sure he has examples in Arizona that I just described in Kinney County, Texas. But that were we talking about the, why don't we have resources between the ports of entry? And the answer is, oh, well, because Republicans won't fund it. Or is it because the Border Patrol is being used at the places where they're having to process people into the country because of the blatant abuse of asylum and parole laws. Parole, which is supposed to be case by case. Parole, which was 400,000 last year under parole. By the way, how many of those were flown around the country to various places around the United States? All these parole abuses, by the way, had we passed H.R. 2 instead of the fraudulent cover bill the Democrats put forward, which couldn't even get out of the Senate, by the way. I want to blame it on President Trump. They couldn't even get it out of the Senate. They're in the majority. They couldn't even get it moving. That bill would not have dealt with the asylum issues. H.R. 2 would have, and Laken Riley is dead specifically because an individual was paroled into the United States in violation of the law requiring case-by-case analysis. Would the gentleman from Arizona respond to that?
Yeah, a lot to respond to. I'll just tell you in Del Rio, when I've been in Del Rio, talking to their fire chief, he'll tell you the exact same thing. They've got 3 ambulances for that whole region, and many times they'll have 2 ambulances that are taken up with dealing with illegal aliens. They've got the river, they've got drownings, they've got people coming across, and sometimes they basically have put together a team that is 1 ambulance 24/7 to deal with assisting illegal aliens, so their own residents get delayed care. Talk to the administrator of the hospital there. He will tell you, yeah, these people get brought in here who are illegally in the country, and our local residents have to go behind them sometimes. Yuma, Arizona, the hospital, they have 1 hospital in a town of about 100,000 people. In that hospital, they'll tell you the exact same thing. Crime is up. They'll tell you the same thing in Cochise County, where in a small town of 20,000 people, every day they have multiple high-speed chases. What from? Illegal aliens, human and drug smuggling. Not through a port of entry, but between the port of entry. Got a video just the other day of, once again, they've started actually, Mr. Roy, I think you can appreciate this, in Arizona, where we don't have fencing in a lot of places, they're literally, I've got a video of them laying down on a barbed wire fence, a ramp where the truck goes up and over.
Yep.
So you're exactly right. What you're saying is true. And this notion that we're trying to fearmonger, we're not trying to fearmonger. And I just have to point out, can I just point out one other thing that the ranking member from Judiciary said? He basically said, you know, we don't know. Maybe Philadelphia had a deficit in 1 year, and so they had to cut their police department. So what he's essentially saying is it's okay for the local government to cut police funding for whatever reason, but it's not okay to examine that for the federal. And we don't just have 1 year of bad money. We're looking at $35 trillion in national debt, and so you got to take that into account as well. And so I'll yield back to you.
Well, what I would note, and I'll just ask the gentleman if he has a similar situation in Arizona, I don't know how much the people of Arizona have had to pay out of their own pocket in order to do the job that the federal government refuses to do, because I can tell you in Texas, we have spent about $13 billion. $13 billion in Operation Lone Star since 2021 in trying to make sure we do the job the federal government refuses to do. Our DPS troopers are down in South Texas. Our DPS troopers are the ones who are having to police the counties because our local law enforcement can't do the job. Our DPS troopers are not able to be up in North Texas, West Texas, the Panhandle, East Texas. They're not able to be policing our roads, policing the fentanyl traffic up through the cities, which does get in through the ports of entry. Because even if you're capturing X percent of it, you know, Y percent of it is still getting through the ports of entry, and a crap ton is still getting in between the ports of entry. So you need law enforcement to be able to go stop it when it's going up I-35, up through the guts of our cities, or going across I-10, all the way from Houston over to El Paso. Our people are the ones left holding the bag and dealing with that. Our people are the ones who are getting killed. The 6 kids in the school district in which I live and where my family lives who died from fentanyl poisoning last year. I assume the gentleman understands the extent to which Texas, at $13 billion, I assume the people of Arizona have had to spend hundreds of millions, billions, I don't know, of dollars to do the job the federal government refuses to do in our constitutional system of government.
Yeah, we obviously are a much smaller state, about 7 million plus in our state. We haven't had to spend $13 billion. You've got a governor who cares. Our governor in Arizona, the first thing she did is she disbanded our border task force within our DPS. Second thing she did is she took down barriers that we had that have never come back up. And we actually have literally hundreds of miles in Arizona that, I shouldn't say hundreds, we're just under 100 miles that actually have no fence whatsoever, no river, no natural barrier. Why? Because there is we've got two tribes that don't want any fencing on there. So we have 4-strand barbed wire fence. So the reality is we have folks coming in, and I don't think you'd gotten here yet. I mentioned this in a meeting with Tucson Sector Chief Modlin last week. 2018 to 2021, encounters in the Tucson sector averaged 60,000 a year. It went up to, when our new president came in, it went up to 130,000 the next year, more than double. Then it went up to 250,000. Last year it was up to 380,000. And already they're on pace. They've already they've outpaced the entire last year. They're on pace to go over 700,000 encounters this year. Mr. Roy, that means that there's no place for those people to go. They're getting processed by agents. That's why I can drive along literally miles along the road with no agents ever coming into contact, but I can sure tell you, I come in contact with the illegal aliens crossing.
And so this legislation, the Police Our Border Act, in order to get more information on the impact on law enforcement is useful in the current environment where we're dealing with not just federal law enforcement, but state and local. And I would note that, we've got, I can't remember, I don't have the stats in front of me. If I can get them, I'll try to present them to the committee or to the gentleman, but thousands of pounds, I can safely say that, thousands of pounds of fentanyl has been intercepted by DPS, Texas DPS, who have been deployed by Texas to South Texas to deal with the fact that we're not intercepting it at the border. So that's the reality of what we're having to deal with and what we're having to spend money on. So the impact on law enforcement is very real. I can tell you, in talking to DPS agents and the head of DPS for Texas, that they're having to do that work, and therefore they're not doing other work. So I'm assuming that there's similar impact in Arizona, but I'll move to one other topic, which is just the issue of generally on crime. And we've been talking about it. The gentlelady before referred to that there's no issue with the defunding of police, right? Well, the fact of the matter is the rhetoric and the actions of federal leaders on this topic, in addition to what we've seen by local leaders on this topic, has been very clear and obvious, right? There's been, very obvious statements back in the 2020 timeframe with the issues involving Mr. Floyd, and in 2021, and then all that followed from that. Cori Bush's statement was very public about defunding the police. I don't have to enter it in the record, but it was very public. In fact, it caused Nancy Pelosi in an interview with George Stephanopoulos to say, quote, "With all due respect in the world to Cori Bush, that is not the position of the Democratic Party." Yet if you go through and look at quote after quote after quote of numerous members of the Democratic Party and the actions of Democrats across the country, it has led to a massive defunding of police around the country. It is undeniably and factually true. In Austin, where we had a significant defunding of the police in Austin, we are now 350 police below the level we're supposed to have, below the level we had 4 or 5 years ago. We have rampant crime skyrocketing, the highest levels of crime we've had in Austin forever. Again, that is a state and local issue. I grant that. The issue is that our Democratic colleagues use the rhetoric of defunding the cops and have been talking about that for the better part of 4 or 5 years. And in fact, and I'll give the gentleman from New York, with whom we've had some incredible agreement lately with respect to FISA and other issues, which has been nice. It fell just short on that one amendment. I wish we had passed. But
212 to 212.
I know, it's 212 to 212, I know. But there was the event, and I'm sure the gentleman knows this and will respond to it, but I want to give him the chance to, where the gentleman joined with our colleague, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, in a letter involving with respect to the Metropolitan Transportation Authority about officers in the subways to reduce crime. And it was a letter to say that, well, we don't need that funding. And the gentleman signed it. This is a letter in roll call. There's a story on this that says the letter to then Governor Andrew Cuomo opposed a plan to put 500 new Metropolitan Transportation Authority officers in the subways to reduce crime. Your colleague, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, said she and her fellow members wrote that the MTA funding for increased police presence in the subways would be better spent on, quote, desperately needed resources like subway bus maintenance and service improvements. The subway system is now safer than before. and I'll let the gentleman respond, but I mean, observers and people that I know looking at the evidence and obviously the things that we're seeing happening on subways, and I'm a big fan of going to New York and riding the mass transit in New York and have been historically, but there's a lot of concerns by a lot of people being raised about the state of affairs there in addition to what's happening in D.C. But I want to give the gentleman a chance to
There is
respond.
indeed a lot of concern, and properly so. And I don't know what Ms. Ocasio-Cortez's motive was for supporting that decrease. I supported it because it was part of an arrangement, as I alluded to before, to shift resources to the Department of Social Services because it was judged that we needed social services for the mentally ill people in the subway system, and that the Department of Social Services was better equipped to provide those services than was the police department. Police are not trained in how to deal with mentally ill people, at least not as well as people from the Department of Social Services. So we took I forget how much money it was, we took a certain amount of money from the police department and shifted it to the Department of Social Services to provide, in a better way, we thought, what was necessary in the subway.
Does the gentleman think that's been working out?
We still have problems, but I think it's somewhat better than it was.
Well, I would be respectful and just say, look, this legislation, the stuff that we have before us, is trying to make sure that we're clear that D.C., where we have a very clear impact on what's happening here, that we're making sure that we're safe in our nation's capital, that broadly speaking, we're making sure we're getting the information about the burden on law enforcement with respect to the border, which is having a massive impact, and then ensuring that we're condemning, calls for defunding the police around the country, and that is distinct from what we've been dealing with and talking about some of the issues involving federal agencies. And one thing that was posited earlier, that it was, quote, our job to fund federal law enforcement, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there is a role for the federal government in coordinating interstate crime, interstate criminal activities, and coordinating among the states to do that. But the extent to which we have a call for a national police is not something that is, I think, central to the constitutional framework, and is, in fact, something that we ought to be working carefully to stay out of the way of local and state governments to be able to police crime and coordinate across states rather than trying to consume power into the federal government. I was happy to work just this week to stop legislation that I thought was going to overly criminalize and federalize crime. I had some conversations with my Democratic colleagues along those lines of trying to prohibit, to limit that. So hopefully there's some ways in which we can agree, and I'll yield back to the chairman.
Chair, thanks, gentleman. Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York for questions.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Well,
I yield back.
Chair, thanks, the gentlelady. Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Texas is recognized for questions.
Thank the chairman. I thank all y'all for being here and testifying. And I'll try to be brief. He's covered these things. With respect to the CDBC issue, with respect to a central digital bank currency. If I'm correct, right, was it in March, what year is this, 24? In March of 22, like 2 years ago, President Biden signed an executive order, right, exploring the pros, cons, benefits, the path forward or whatever on such a concept, right? So it's not without concern that this is something that's right in front of us as a nation, right? I would assume this is should be one of the less partisan things that we should be putting forward. That regardless of one's ideology or political bent, that the concept of any government being able to insert itself into the currency that is being used to carry out free enterprise between an American citizen and another American citizen engaging in commerce, and therefore then use the power of government to influence the choices in commerce beyond what we already do with respect to tax policy, with respect to other levers of governmental power, that is the genesis behind what we're trying to do here with prohibition. Mr. Hill, would you be able to expand on that a little bit? I know you said so in your opening statement, but I think it's really critical for people to understand. People always they always try to kind of mock or laugh at the slippery slope arguments, and I've yet to have seen a slippery slope argument made over the last 20 years that hasn't roughly been correct for the most part. And so I would just suggest that if we go down the road of CDBC, that this government would be able to insert itself into policy choices on right and left, right? You know, this money cannot be used for an abortion. This money cannot be used for a purchase of a gun. This money can be used only for charging a car versus buying gas, or this money can be used. Pick your ideological spectrum. It's happened in real time in other governments around the country, notably in China. I just wonder again if the gentleman from Arkansas would expand on that a little bit, because I think it's central to some of the concerns Americans have.
I thank the gentleman from Texas, and I don't share his affection for A&M baseball and the defeat of the Razorbacks over the weekend.
Two out of three, it is.
But I do share his concern over this particular notion, and I think that I make the following points. One, the ambiguity that somehow a central bank in our government could issue a retail, what we think is a retail central bank digital currency, which is where our citizens, our businesses would have accounts at the Fed and transact activity in the central bank digital currency, that could be done without a strict authorization oversight by Congress. That's point one where I agree with you. I think there's bipartisan opposition to that. And we've had bills on the floor. In fact, I've co-sponsored a bill with the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Auchincloss, in opposition to it, because under Article 1, it's quite clear that we are responsible for the money coinage and that we've delegated that to the Treasury, and the Treasury has got the Federal Reserve in a distribution fiscal agent status. Number two, I think people should be concerned about the potential of abuse in a situation like that for their privacy and their transactions. And why would they feel that way? I think because of the pattern and practice that they've seen over just the time I've served in Congress. Operation Choke Point, just to name one. So I think we want to make sure that we err on caution by prohibiting this and by saying again, reiterating, it can't be done without authorization of the Congress. Third and final point. In my judgment, the current chairman of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, Jay Powell, agrees with that. But guess what? The comments have been ambiguous at the Fed and in the administration. And so I think it's important that Article 1, branch of the government, speak clearly here, and that's why I'm in favor of this bill, and I yield back to the gentleman from Texas.
I will in 1 second, if I can follow up and then open it up to the gentlelady. Unlike current dollars in circulation, now obviously we use credit cards, obviously we use Venmo, and let me just say that on Venmo, right? Are there not current efforts by the IRS to say transactions over a certain dollar amount, like $600, and Venmo should have greater scrutiny and greater, reporting and potential regulation? Is that not something that is happening in real time? And then I'll add to that, you can answer that, unlike currency, to the extent we still use currency, that this has a digital tether, right? I mean, there is a connection, a connectivity in terms of what you're talking about in the currency. So putting aside the extent to which we've gone, heavily digital with respect to credit cards, you've got a one-to-one relationship with your credit card company and the systems in place, which of course are regulated. Here, when you go straight up to a currency with that kind of a tether, that there is really, to a significant extent, no real limit other than us on what the government can then do with that, whether it's freezing or seizing assets, with respect to, as I was mentioning before, programming spending. And, I might just say, like, when we talk about these items, you brought up Operation Choke Point. I would also say we saw a lot of these questions, again, without raising the issues of debates that unfortunately got somewhat partisan, but I think we had some agreement and disagreement during COVID. Well, the extent to which government power was being used to then effectuate what citizens could or could not do, would not such a currency give significant and greater power for the government to do that, regardless of the merits? Whatever one thinks about masks and vaccines, mandates, whether you can leave 6 feet circles, whatever the hell you want to go down the line of talking about COVID, wouldn't such a mechanism provide a significant amount more power to the government to be able to effectuate the policies that were trying to be carried out during COVID? But the gentleman expand on those couple of questions, and then I'll turn it to the gentlelady.
implemented at a retail level with direct accounts, it absolutely would. And I think people have a right, as I said, to be concerned about their privacy. That would be the ultimately non-private activity. And I'll give you one other more contemporary example rather than choke point, and that's a debate we've had in the House Financial Services Committee for several Congresses, but intensely last week when we supported a bill by Barry Loudermilk of Georgia on something called the Consolidated Audit Trail that collects everybody's stock trades every day in every brokerage account and are not protecting PII, the personal information associated with that. And that would allow someone to mix that with open source data and triangulate in another database for a hack that makes TikTok look benign. And so this risk is on the top of minds, I think, of the American people. And that's, again, why I think implemented as you describe it, yes, it should be of serious concern to our families for their privacy rights. And I think they have had examples recently, in our recent past, that would indicate the government's a terrible privacy protector. I'll yield back to the gentleman.
The gentlelady had wanted to make a comment.
Yes, thank you so very much. Currently, the Federal Reserve is engaged in a pilot project that looks at how distributed ledger technology can be used to improve efficiency of cross-border payments and settlements involving multiple currency. This is occurring in coordination with other G7 countries, which are also engaged in similar projects to speed up and lower the cost of doing business around the world. Furthermore, all G20 countries are doing the same. In making the United States the only country on the planet to ban a CBDC is just unthinkable. But let me repeat that the only country to prohibit a CBDC would be what Representative Emmer's isolationist bill would do in stopping this testing in its tracks. It would undercut America's commitment to its allies and seriously impair our ability to influence the standards adopted by other nations as we forge ahead with CBDC. All I'm saying is this, if I may, and that is, we don't want to be seen as a country that's not futuristic enough to at least look at it, to explore it, to test, to find out. Right now, we're the only country that is proposing, any of our members proposing a ban. All I'm saying is, let's not stop what the Fed is doing in trying to do the research.
So look, I appreciate the exchange with the gentlelady. Yes. I would make two comments. One, the idea that America being alone in choosing a path is probably, in my mind, an indication that that path might be a good one. That's just a personal observation about the tendencies of our, of other countries around the world. And I kind of like it when America's thinking independently and trying to think about figuring out how we're going to preserve liberty and make sure that we don't have government control of currency. And I would note, and I say this as a positive, the gentlelady was on the floor when we were having a significant amount of debate in a hotly contested vote that I think I might have disagreed with some of my Republican colleagues on the panel about warrants as it related to FISA. And I would note a overall philosophy for me that I shared. The gentlelady made a comment on the floor saying, you said I'm old enough to remember, respectfully, I'm quoting you, old enough to remember J. Edgar Hoover. And you made the point on the floor about the extent to which the empowerment of government is concerning. And I would just note in this instance, where I might have some disagreements with my colleagues on this side of the aisle and the other side of the aisle on that particular vote, you and I were aligned on that vote, I would just posit here for consideration that what we're doing here, what we're attempting to do, is to Congress speak up and say, no, you're not going to do this. You're not going to go empower government to be able to control a currency at the level that we believe can be foisted on the American people this way. And that does not foreclose continued debate, investigation, discussion about where that would go. We have plenty of committee hearings. We can have plenty of consideration. Fed can research whatever the hell it wants to research, but we could have a debate about this. But my only point is, I believe it is critically important that Congress speak to say that the power of government should not be used to allow government to be inserted between our use of currency and engaging in free enterprise. But with that, in the interest of time, I will yield back to the chairman.
Chair, thanks, gentleman. Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from New Mexico for questions.
Thank you so very much. And it strikes me.
Mr. Roy from Texas.
I thank the chair. Appreciate the gentleman from appearing. Just a couple of questions for the chairman. I think you just articulated some of the things I wanted to make sure was clear for the record about what we're talking about here. Under current law, but I want to make sure it's clear for everyone to understand. Under current law, if a state wants to ensure that it is only a citizen voting, does that state face barriers to ensuring that that is the case?
100%, that's an accurate statement. They're not allowed, they're actually prevented from asking applicants for documentary proof of U.S. citizenship under current law, and that's the Supreme Court's decision in 2013 of Arizona versus Intertribal, their review of NVRA and federal preemption.
And as such, has that caused problems, for example, with respect to Arizona, where Arizona currently basically operates two separate systems, where they register individuals checking proof of citizenship for state and local elections, but they, on the federal side, do not, because of this barrier put in place prohibiting them, in essence, due to the court's interpretation of MVRA, prohibiting them from being able to check citizenship. Is that an accurate statement?
Yes.
And what we're endeavoring to do here, which obviously was debated and amended in committee, if I'm correct, I believe that the ranking member's amendment was offered in committee and failed 6-1.
That's accurate.
And there was a significant number of Democrats not present at that hearing.
6-1 indicates that.
Right. And so that amendment was offered. There was, at least debate with the one Democrat who was present, given that there were no other Democrats present at the hearing. But with respect to what we're trying to do with this legislation, we're trying to first make sure that barrier is brought down, but go a step further, given the extent to which we now have, and I would ask the chairman if he agrees with me, increasing evidence that there are jurisdictions seeking to register non-citizens to vote, at least at allegedly the state and local level, but wink, wink, nod, nod, don't worry, we'll never have those registrants being involved in federal voting. But the truth is, there's an expansive view in Oakland, San Francisco, New York, tried to happen here in the District of Columbia, right? We had a vote on that here in the House. So would the gentleman agree what we're seeking to do is to do what many states do right now and attempt to do, but are prevented because of the Supreme Court opinion, require a documentary proof of citizenship to be able to vote in federal elections to be able to address this problem?
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly what we're trying to do with this legislation, is allow states to have that opportunity to provide documentary proof of citizenship. In fact, require it. And I think you correctly note this administration is working aggressively to roll out a secretive plan on voter registration. In fact, they put forward an executive order, 14019, requiring every agency to put forward a strategic plan as to how they were going to help get out the vote, in effect. And they won't provide us with that strategic plan. I've subpoenaed the 15 administration officials to get that, because I think taxpayers deserve to know how their taxpayer dollars are being used. So you have this administration working in secret to try to roll out and utilize the federal government to get a get out the vote operation. We're, in contrast, just trying to make sure that U.S. citizens are the ones who are voting in U.S. elections.
Gentlemen, aware with respect to the problem we're identifying that our colleagues have suggested does not exist, that there is a significant amount of evidence of people who are non-citizens voting in our elections. A study, for example, professors at Old Dominion University and George Mason University from 2014, finding that non-citizens participate in U.S. elections, and that this participation has been large enough to change meaningful election outcomes, including electoral college votes. Are you aware of that study?
Yes, and we've looked at a number of examples in our committee hearing. I actually think one of the most pertinent examples is the congressional review of the 46th congressional district race in California in 1996, where they actually did a retrospective analysis on who voted. And it was documented that 624 non-citizens voted in that election. And if we extrapolate that across 435 House districts, or you just look at it at a House district where we know often House races are determined by less than 600 votes. We have a colleague from Iowa where it was 6 votes. And so there is documentary proof of non-citizens voting in U.S. elections, and this is why your legislation is so essential.
And it's true that there are multiple states in which in the Electoral College process are states that have been determined by thousands of votes, right? I mean, 10,000 votes in Georgia, less than that in certain other states, 15,000, you know, so those votes are meaningful.
In my home state of Wisconsin, a landslide is 20 or 30,000 total votes. I mean,
Right.
a few thousand votes here or there can swing any battleground state.
The study that I quoted from Old Dominion George Mason estimated that 6.4% of non-citizens voted in the 2008 election, which would represent 1.2 million non-citizen votes cast. I do want to, with all respect, correct my friend from South Carolina. There was a report out of Texas of a number that he quoted about 95,000. He said almost 100,000. That number was later corrected to be 25,000. There was a mistake in the counting. But for the record, there were 25,000 in Texas in that report. Virginia last year removed 1,481 voter registrants for non-citizen status. North Carolina conducted a study in 2014 with over 1,400 registered voters. In 2024, an audit carried out in Ohio flagged 137 individuals. There's list after list after list. And I would note that there are examples. I assume my colleague is aware of certain of our Democrat colleagues, one in particular in January 2024 saying, quote, "I need more people in my district just for redistricting purposes," in a direct response to the border crisis. Does the gentleman remember that
Very much
statement? In other words, the idea that there's not a problem is belied by the facts. The idea that there's not a problem with respect to our border is, of course, belied by the facts. And I'm always entertained by this notion that, well, it's illegal already. Why do you guys need to do this? Well, number one, well, then what are you worried about? Number two, if it being illegal solves the problem, then the fact that it is illegal for people to enter the United States, you would think would solve this rather enormous problem of millions of people being released into the United States, correct?
That's spot on.
Yet here we sit. I would note, in addition, that we've got some people raising issues about that this will cause a burden to those who wish to vote for citizens. Is the gentleman aware is that the list of items that we put in the legislation mirrors numerous existing state laws? For example, that bastion of wing nuttery, the state of Massachusetts. The language that we put in the bill is very similar to that which is put forward by the state of Massachusetts. The gentleman agree?
Yep.
And the documentation that we talked about, we have provisions replete in the bill to allow people and allow administrators to create mechanisms, for example, for women, spouses who change names, individuals who want to be able to provide a different route to be able to provide evidence if they run into a barrier with, coming up with a passport or a real ID or in the military examples. Is that correct?
The EAC opportunity to provide that guidance to states is a key component of the bill.
And a last, I think, important point, which is the extent to which this is very inherently a role for Congress and a federal issue. The extent to which the Constitution very much contemplates that, of course, the time, place, and manner of holding elections, shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof, but the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations, right? Then you follow the jurisprudence and you figure out, okay, there's some debate about whether the how versus the who, that question which the court has raised. In this case, of course, the Constitution contemplates that the naturalization clause puts Congress, frankly, the court has placed it maybe even higher than intended, Congress at the full center of making determinations about all things naturalization. So the combination of the Elections Clause and the Naturalization Clause, combined with the numerous amendments, the 15th, 19th, 24th, 26th, all referencing, quote, the right of citizens of the United States to vote, I think clearly demonstrates the power and the duty of Congress to act in this case. Would the gentleman from Wisconsin agree?
I agree.
And so at the end of the day, we have the power, we have the duty, we have legislation to resolve a very real and growing problem. We have 80+% of Americans wanting us to solve said problem and guarantee that only citizens vote. We have put forward legislation to do that under the powers that we have under the Constitution. We are solving a real barrier to states being able to conduct their duty to do this and providing a mechanism for federal elections only, a requirement that it be consistent across the country. Is that a fair characterization?
It's fair.
I yield back.
I'm going to recognize Mr. Roy.
I thank the gentlelady. I thank the chair. Mr. Harris, is there anything that stops Congress from passing an appropriations bill at any point after a CR is adopted that would, whether it's an omnibus appropriations bill or all 12 appropriations bills? In other words, if a CR is adopted of any length, whether it be 3 months or a year, can Congress continue to do its work, pass appropriations bills, and override the CR?
Well, the gentleman makes a good point. You don't override the CR. The CR actually has an expiration date for funding, just like our expiration date for funding right now is September 30th, yet we pass appropriations bills in June. In fact, just to correct the record on the VA, and somehow Republicans don't care about veterans, that's the first bill we brought to the floor, June 6th. And it passed the House on a party line vote. That means that every Republican voted, and by the way, the amount for VA medical care funding was at the president's budget request.
Right.
It went to the Senate where it has languished for 3 months. So if we're worried about who cares about veterans and who doesn't, I suggest you call Mr. Schumer up and say, hey, remember that bill we sent over there on June 7th, because we passed it on the 6th, and went over there on the 7th, and it's sat there. The fact of the matter is, it's just that it's an expiration date. It's not the date you have to pay. I mean, we don't have to pass those bills on March 28th. We could pass them in December. We could pass them in November. We could pass them in January. In fact, if the Senate begins to do its job and conference with us, pass some of the bills on the floor, we sent 5 over, that we sent 4 because I think Homeland Security is still over here because Senate refuses to take up a real border bill, H.R. 2, not the phony one that was put up in the Senate. If the Senate takes up those 4 bills that are over there, we could conference them next week. We could answer all these defense questions, all these things that the gentlelady brings up, the ranking member brings up. We could address all of them in a negotiation on the House-passed defense appropriations bill because it's been sitting in the Senate. The Senate hasn't even brought their defense appropriations bill to the floor. Now, again, I will reiterate, Mr. Austin seems to have misplaced the criticism here. The criticism should be on the Senate not doing the job it should be doing with the defense appropriations bill.
And so, just putting a finer point on that, the debate about a expiration date on the CR, in this case, March 28th, is really just a debate about when we're putting the pressure point, right? It's not a debate about whether or not the appropriations bills can ultimately get finished or not. That is a separate question. We have 5 appropriations bills that we've passed. We have 4 that are sitting in the Senate. The Senate has passed how many bills, to the best of the gentleman's knowledge?
None off the floor.
0. And so the House has passed 4. We have a 5th that's sitting at the desk. We have others that we've been debating. We've gotten them out of committee. So then the question is the gentleman aware, 4 times in basically my lifetime since the mid-1970s have we passed appropriations bills, 12 appropriations bills on time? Is that correct?
It was before my time here. Since my time here, we have never passed all 12 bills on time.
Right. And how often, rarely do we pass 12 independent appropriations bills even late, correct? Normally it's an omnibus or a CR. I'm not saying that's good. I'm saying that's the way we've been doing things. Is that correct?
That is, and the gentleman wasn't here when I mentioned that earlier in my testimony. That is the way we do it. That's not the way it's supposed to be done.
Right.
But now the expectation here is that you don't pass an individual appropriations bill, no matter how important defense is or the VA is. You put them on a shelf somewhere until you get a minibus or an omnibus. That's not the way it's meant to be.
So
but you're
without
absolutely right.
just a nonpartisan question, House's fault, Senate's fault, Democrats' fault, Republicans' fault, are we going to pass 12 appropriations bills in any way, shape, or form by September 30th? Independently.
I don't believe we will.
On either side.
But again, there are 4 bills. The claim is the Republicans haven't done their job. We've done our job on 4 bills that sit over there. And I'll remind the gentleman that those 4 bills total up to more than half the spending. Had those bills been processed by the Senate, gone to conference, and come back to the floor,
then we'd be in a position to potentially do a smaller CR, having done those appropriations. I agree. But point being, whoever's fault, Again, the Senate has passed 0 appropriation bills. We've passed 5, 4, 1 held at the desk, 4 sitting in the Senate. It is unlikely that we're going to have the 12 independent bills passed and signed into law by September 30th. Is that a fair statement?
That's a very fair statement.
And the gentlelady is nodding in agreement, correct?
Of course.
Right. Again, regardless of fault. So my point of saying that is, to those that question the CR, I don't like CRs. I don't like CRs as a way of doing business. But we've got to figure out what to do with one in this context, in this environment. So then the question becomes, what's the expiration date? Question for the gentlelady. You expressed earlier, I think, I just want to make sure I understand for the record, that you think it ought to expire on a shorter time, I think December.
December.
Is that didn't you posit that earlier?
The way we've done this in the past, in terms of the negotiation, we were able to sort out the differences by, mid to later, but in December, getting it done before the end of the calendar.
Okay, and do you know, just for purposes of trying to figure out what that would look like, right, in terms of putting together what would be almost certainly an omnibus, right, probably not 12 independent bills, then in addition, what would be the likelihood, do you know what the timing is of Ukraine expiration and whether that would be a part of the discussion on the funding?
I think that we're talking about the bills that are currently before the body that we have, as you pointed out.
Right.
There are 5 bills that have been passed. There are additional 7 that still need to be. One would have to be sitting down with the view of getting it done in the way that we have done in the past, and that means hard negotiations. And what we did the last time in terms of doing this, and it was still carried over to March, you've got to be done with the extraneous, non-germane riders that are part of the bills. You've got to focus in on what the FRA said in terms of an increase of 1% for defense and an increase of 1% for non-defense. If we follow the rules of the road, we could get this done in short order.
But it would be an omnibus, almost certainly.
An omnibus, a minibus, et cetera.
And
We're not
so,
going to do
right.
individual bills.
Which is one of those things. It goes back to my point about timing, right? It goes to my point about picking the date. We pick dates, just for the average viewer out there, we pick dates based typically on a pressure point. We don't pick, because you can always pass the appropriations bills. We can pass them tomorrow. We could do an omnibus in December, even if we have a March date or a full year CR. I personally would rather just have a 1-year CR. Just set it, go ahead and fund it, and then we could debate it. But the reason I think the gentlelady's shaking her hand, the others, is that if you don't set the date at a certain date to try to trigger, we're going to run out of money, then there's not a pressure point. And the reason typically it's done in December is not like, some joy, we want to get this done before the next calendar year. Our fiscal year is September 30th. It's because it's Christmas.
Well, we should have done it by September 30th, and we could have.
But it's always done, but the Senate's passed 0. Let's go back to that. Again, not casting blame. I'm talking here for the good of the country. I'm trying to figure out, because Americans scratch their head and they go, what are you doing? And then you look up and whatever always happens. So let's go back to the Ukraine question. The reason I asked the question to my gentleman, my friend from Maryland, did we not start the Ukraine funding with basically a $45 billion funding in December on an omnibus 2 years ago, before we had the plus up this last spring?
Yes.
And so if you're an average American sitting out there going, well, do I want a CR that is expiring on, say, December 15th, setting up a pre-Christmas pressure point wherein we are deciding how to fund government for the rest of this fiscal year, right before Christmas, and the question of Ukraine funding expiration is now out in the press, that it's going to be running out of money by the end of the year? Would there not be a potential pressure for there to be a grand bargain of significant spending in an omnibus spending in December, along with potentially another large pot of money for Ukraine? Would the gentleman from Maryland agree that, based on your experience in this town, that is not an insignificant likelihood if a CR is put till December 15th?
It's not only an insignificant likelihood, but it disenfranchises the idea of coming back in a lame duck session, disenfranchises the American voters who will have made a decision in the beginning of November, perhaps to take this country in a different direction. And to me, that's the reason why, again, we don't know what the outcome of the election is going to be, but let's set the deadline into the next administration, into the next Congress. because I think that's just fair for the American voters. They're going to make a big decision this fall, and it would be a shame if this Congress, in a lame duck session, did things like that. Again, with the pressure of a debt ceiling, with the pressure of a Ukraine funding, with the pressure of Israeli funding. I mean, you could do the whole laundry list. What it does is it allows a lame duck legislature to make major decisions, and I think that's just not right for the American people.
I agree. So let me move then off of the spending issue to the SAVE Act issue. Is the gentleman from Maryland aware that in Texas on August 26th, they announced the removal of 6,500 non-citizens from the voter rolls? In Virginia in August, the Attorney General announced 6,303 non-citizens. Since 2014, Virginia has removed 11,000 non-citizens. Alabama has removed 3,251. Ohio just announced 597. And I could go on and on down the list of states. North Carolina, 1,454. But importantly, is it not true that under current law, the way the courts have applied the NVRA, that if you're a state like Arizona, and you say, we believe and have passed a law saying we want to ensure documentary proof of citizenship to ensure that only citizens vote in American elections, that in the case of Arizona, the courts have said, sorry, you can't do that for federal elections because the courts have interpreted it as violating the NVRA because the NVRA sets out certain documents and materials that you can collect. So in other words, the federal law has been interpreted by federal judges to prohibit states from ensuring the enforcement of the law that non-citizens not vote, that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle present to the American people as an already established fact. Is it not also true that it's an already established fact of law that you're not supposed to be here illegally? But yet we have 20 million people here. Is a gentleman agree that that is a problem that the SAVE Act sets out to address?
So, and again, given the way motor voter registration occurs in Maryland, I wouldn't be surprised if there were thousands of illegal aliens in Maryland who were registered to vote and who should be taken off the rolls. But the upshot is that Congress thought that a belt was enough, and the courts said it's not. We're going to have to put suspenders on this too, and that's what the SAVE Act does. It clarifies the law so that the court cannot go to a state like they did in Arizona and say, you can't do this. I think that clarification needs to be made because there are states who care about whether or not illegal aliens vote in elections.
One other question. So we had 143 of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle opposed a bill to overturn the District of Columbia's law allowing illegal aliens to vote in local elections. Now, that's D.C. We have authority over D.C. as Congress. So we put legislation before. Now, 52 Democrats voted for it. I mean, I'll give credit where it's due. But 100 to this point about, well, it's already illegal to vote as a non-citizen. But yet we have 143 Democrats who are leaning into wanting to allow D.C. to have illegal aliens not just vote, but we're being recruited to vote, targeted to vote in what you would call the local elections for D.C. So is it not true that we have jurisdictions across the country, San Francisco, Oakland, D.C., like I just mentioned, New York and other places, that have been actively seeking to recruit and register non-citizens for claim to be state and local elections? So now you're doing that, and then at the same time saying, don't worry, it's against the law, but just trust me in terms of the voters for the federal elections. Is that not the state of things, and is that not what the SAVE Act sets to address?
So that's right. It creates an administrative nightmare. So, for instance, there are jurisdictions in Maryland that want 16-year-olds to vote in local elections, especially school board elections. But you can imagine, I mean, we talk about a voter roll, but in fact, you'd have to keep multiple voter rolls. And we know that some states are better than others at keeping voter rolls with integrity. So it sets a standard that is necessary, and again, that the American people expect. They do not expect a person who crossed the border illegally to have a say in federal elections.
So last question for the gentleman of Maryland, and I'll yield back my time, because it has been raised an issue about the timing of the SAVE Act and whether it would have an impact on this election. And let me share the concerns raised by my friend from Kentucky and others about, how this plays out in terms of timing. And, lack of joy of saying that we're at a place where we haven't passed 12 appropriations bills. I wish we had. I wish we weren't doing a CR like we always do. But we are where we are. And so the question here with respect to the SAVE Act and timing, would the gentleman agree, by and large, I'll posit some things that I think is important for everybody to know, is that the bill would be effective upon enactment, is the way it's drafted, that it will still be effective because a number of states, 22 states, allow for election day registration. So we got to keep in mind, people say, well, people are already registered. Well, that assertion is correct that a lot of states have already registration, and dates that have already passed, but we have same-day registration in certain states. We have a significant impact where there's other states that have expired. For example, Nevada is same day. North Carolina, I think, is same-day registration permitted during early voting. Pennsylvania has 15 days before the election. In other words, there's still a lot of time between now and election day with respect to those issues. Does the gentleman agree that that's important in the consideration with respect to timing?
I would agree, and not only that, there is no bad time to do this because, again, the American people actually think that the protections are in place so that illegal aliens are not voting in our federal elections, and the fact of the matter, which the gentleman from Texas has brought up, due to the Arizona ruling, indicates that those protections are not really in place. So there is no bad time to do it. This should have been done. Honestly, it should have been taken up by the Senate when it was passed, when this bipartisan bill, and remember, this was passed on a bipartisan basis. When it was sent over to the Senate, shame on the Democrat majority in the Senate. They should have taken it up. And again, I will reiterate, I suspect they didn't because it actually could pass, because an overwhelming majority of Americans agree with the idea that people in this country illegally should not be voting in a federal election.
And the gentleman is aware that the legislation requires states to remove non-citizens for their existing roles through the election. So in other words, if we were to pass this into law by the September 30th deadline, we will have funded the United States government, including our men and women in uniform, and including all the things that are concerned about through March 28th, giving time for a new election to have transpired and a new set of priorities to be established, not doing it during the lame duck. And we would have set up a situation in which we'd have the SAVE Act, which is supported, the issue is supported by 80+% of the American people, and it would then give time still to, and require, to clean non-citizens from their existing roles through the election, and the tools, it gives them access to databases they don't currently have a requirement and access to have access to. And so I think that's an important piece of this, in addition to additional penalties for federal employees and state and local election officials that register non-citizens to vote. It enhances those penalties so that you can make sure that we have a belief in our elections. Final point that has been made about the VA, for the gentleman from Maryland, is it not true that we basically have the VA secretary saying we have more people applying for this than we thought, so that those of us who had raised concerns when the PACT Act was passed, and we were saying this was going to create a system that was going to be very difficult to predict and administer, and raise those issues, and even some of us voted against and didn't want to vote against because we have constituents suffering from burn pit harm, but we said this is going to be a problem. And now are we not sitting here looking at the piper being here that has to be paid, and this is the problem? Would the gentleman agree with that, and then I'll yield back?
Well, I do, and that's why the Congress, in its wisdom, has $112 billion in advanced appropriation to do this. So this is not the emergency that it is being held up as, and evidence of that is that the Senate hasn't taken up the VA appropriations bill yet, and that would be a totally appropriate vehicle to deal with this issue on a more permanent basis. But this CR, because of the $112 billion advance appropriation, it is not essential to be doing it at this time. It's actually more appropriate to do it through the normal appropriations process.
Thanks, gentlemen. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, Chair. Thanks. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an hour or two of questions. I'm kidding. I wouldn't do that.
Order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. We welcome everyone to today's hearing on non-citizen voting. I will now recognize myself for an opening statement. I thank our witnesses for being here today. Governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. As Americans, we know that to be self-evident truth listed in the Declaration of Independence. But it really was something truly unique both at the time and in human history. We as American citizens are not ruled, we govern. The way we do that is at the ballot box. But President Biden and Kamala Harris's border crisis poses a direct threat to this fundamental right, and it is intentional. Radical progressive Democrats' near universal opposition to both H.R. 2 and the SAVE Act prove that this is all by design. Now, less than 2 months before the 2024 election, this threat could not be more real. Last week, I released a 36-page report detailing the scope of the border crisis. The report illustrates how Biden-Harris open border policies are fundamentally remaking America. More specifically, it analyzes how the massive influx of illegal aliens under this administration, on top of the millions of non-citizens already living in the United States, could upend federal elections for years to come. Since President Biden and Kamala Harris took office, over 8.5 million illegal aliens have crossed the southern border. 5.6 million illegal aliens have been released directly into the United States. Almost 2 million illegal aliens that we know of have evaded Border Patrol as what are called gotaways. Taken together, at least 7.5 million illegal aliens have entered the United States since January 2021, and they are living in every corner of the country. This year, the foreign-born population hit a record of over 50 million, 15.6% of the total population, the highest level in U.S. history. Conservative estimates show non-citizens make up about 30 million of that population, but it very well could be much higher. Non-citizens will vote in the 2024 election because our system not only makes it easy to do, but incentivizes doing so. The Biden-Harris administration baselessly claims it is extraordinarily rare for non-citizens to illegally vote in federal elections. A 2014 study from professors at Old Dominion University and George Mason University estimated that 6.4% of non-citizens, 1.2 million individuals at that time, illegally voted in the 2008 election. The study concluded that non-citizens very well may have tipped the 2008 Minnesota Senate race in Al Franken's favor and drove President Obama's victory in North Carolina. We can debate the merits of that study, but the point remains. It would only take a few thousand non-citizens voting, much less than the 1.2 million estimated, to impact the outcome of our razor-thin elections. In the 2020 presidential election, regardless of what you think, Arizona was carried by about 10,000 votes, Georgia by about 12,000 votes, Wisconsin by about 20,000 votes, and Pennsylvania by 81,000 votes. Democrats know this, which is why they try to downplay and distract from the issue. The other side also loves to point out that, quote, it is already illegal for non-citizens to vote. That is technically true. They fail to mention that the Supreme Court's interpretation of the National Voter Registration Act of 1993, or the NVRA, literally prohibits states from verifying citizenship during the voter registration process. This means it is impossible for states to enforce the law on the front end. Consequently, the primary defense against non-citizens registering to vote is a literal box-checking exercise on a voter registration form. This is the only barrier the American people have to ensuring that only citizens vote. Because of the Supreme Court ruling in Arizona, an individual who can prove they are a United States citizen is given a full ballot that includes all federal, state, and local elections. But someone who cannot prove they are a United States citizen is given a federal-only ballot, meaning they can vote in presidential, Senate, and congressional elections. That is the upside-down world that we've created. As of August 9th, there were over 41,000 federal-only voters in Arizona who could not prove they were U.S. citizens. Think about that. But the absurdity of the NVRA doesn't stop there. It also forces states to provide voter registration forms to applicants for driver's licenses or welfare benefits. This presents multiple opportunities for non-citizens to register to vote. Every state in the union allows non-citizens to get a driver's license. 19 states and D.C. even allow illegal aliens to get a driver's license. And millions of non-citizens, including many illegal aliens, are eligible for welfare benefits. We know the NVRA is broken because non-citizens are registering to vote and voting. Since 2021, Texas has removed over 6,500 non-citizens from its voter rolls. Over 1,900 had voting histories. Since 2022, Virginia has removed 6,300 non-citizens from its rolls. Alabama removed 3,251 non-citizens from its rolls. Ohio identified 597 non-citizens, 138 had voter histories. The states that are doing the right thing and removing non-citizens from their voter rolls are fighting with one arm tied behind their backs because they get almost no help from the federal government. and Democrat-run states appear to have made little to no effort to clean their voter rolls of non-citizens. I introduced the SAVE Act to ensure that non-citizens, whether knowingly or unknowingly, do not take advantage of our flawed voter registration system. The bill is a simple bill that requires states to obtain proof of citizenship before registering an individual to vote in federal elections. A recent poll found that over 80% of Americans support requiring proof of citizenship to register to vote. SAVE Act's proof of citizenship requirement will ensure that non-citizens do not register to vote, but is easier for U.S. citizens to comply with than driver's license applications in states like New York and Pennsylvania. The bill also requires every state to identify and remove non-citizens on their voter rolls and gives them immediate, no-cost access to federal resources containing citizenship data to do so. Finally, it imposes penalties on officials who illegally register non-citizens to vote. It passed the House in July with 5 Democrats supporting it. Unfortunately, 198 Democrats, including every Democrat on this subcommittee, voted against it. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has refused to hold a vote on the bill in the Senate, and President Biden even threatened to veto it. Now Democrats are threatening to shut down the government because they are so vehemently opposed to preventing non-citizens from voting. So I asked my Democrat colleagues one simple question: why? And the answer is obvious. My colleagues want citizens to legally vote in 2024 election and future elections. It's the only reasonable explanation after forcing years of chaos on the American people. They believe this will help their election prospects and advance their quest to fundamentally remake America. As Congress, we have a constitutional and moral obligation to ensure that does not happen. I now recognize the ranking member, the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Scanlon, for her opening statement.
The chair yields the remainder of his time to the gentleman from Texas.
I thank the witnesses. I thank the chairman. Ms. Nungaray, your daughter was taken from you in June of 2024, this year, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
She was killed by 2 Venezuelan men who crossed into Texas in March and May of this year, correct?
That's correct.
Those 2 Venezuelan men that crossed into Texas were released by this administration into the community after crossing, correct?
That's correct.
Do you believe that your daughter would be here today if they had not been released into the United States?
I so heartedly believe that, yes.
Ms. Marin, your daughter was taken from you in August of 2023, correct?
Yes.
Killed by a man from El Salvador who crossed illegally and was a gotaway. Is that correct?
Yes.
Do you believe your daughter would be here today if the current administration were not overwhelming border patrols such that we have 2 million known gotaways over the last 3 years?
I think that if we had the policies in place that we did a few years ago that vetted the immigrants that came in, that my daughter would still be here.
Ms. Nobles, your daughter was taken from you in July of 2022. Is that correct?
Yes.
By a 17-year-old from El Salvador who entered in March of 2022, just a few months before, correct?
Correct.
Was released into the country. Is that correct?
Correct.
Do you believe that your daughter would be here today if that individual had not been released into the country according to a mass release program that has been underway for the last 3 years?
Yes, she would be alive today if they would have made that one phone call to El Salvador to check, because he did have a criminal record in 2020 and gang-related tattoos.
I yield back.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the gentleman